The amber sunset cast long shadows across Vixara, the gleaming capital of Vixara. From the balcony of the Earth Embassy, Captain George Sullivan watched as the twin moons began their slow ascent into the darkening sky. The larger moon Vexos glowed with a blue-green luminescence that bathed the crystalline spires of the royal palace in an otherworldly light. George adjusted the collar of his diplomatic uniform, still uncomfortable with its stiff formality, after years in combat fatigues. 6 months as security advisor to the Earth Embassy had done little to ease his military bearing or his constant vigilance. Old habits died hard, especially for a man who had spent 15 years in Earth's Special Forces. "Captain Sullivan," a voice called from behind him. "The ambassador is ready to depart for the reception." George turned to face Ambassador Hayes, a tall, slender woman with steel-gray hair and the shrewd eyes of a career diplomat. She wore the formal blue and gold robes that had become standard for Earth's representatives on Vixara. "Any changes to the security briefing, Ambassador?" George asked, falling into step beside her. "None," Hayes replied, her voice lowered as they passed a group of junior diplomats. "But I would remind you that tonight's reception is particularly significant. Princess Alatha has personally arranged this gathering to discuss expanded trade agreements. She's the strongest advocate for human-Vexaran cooperation within the royal family." George nodded. He had heard much about the princess, but had yet to meet her in person. As the sole female heir in the Vexaran royal line, she held a unique position of influence despite the traditionally patriarchal structure of Vexaran society. Her progressive views had earned her both devoted followers and dangerous enemies. "I've doubled the security detail as requested," George said. "Our people have been coordinating with Captain Jarrow of the Royal Guard." "Good." Hayes paused at the embassy entrance where their transport awaited. "Just remember, Captain Sullivan, observe and protect. No unnecessary engagement. The Vexaran are extremely sensitive about their customs and traditions." "Understood, Ambassador." The transport glided silently through the capital's wide avenues. George watched the city pass by through tinted windows. Even after months on this planet, the alien architecture still fascinated him. Organic curves, blended with crystalline structures that seemed to grow directly from the bedrock of the planet itself. The native Vexaran moved gracefully along elevated walkways, their tall, lithe bodies and distinctive tiger-striped skin marking them as clearly non-human. "Princess Alatha is taking considerable political risk with this reception," Hayes commented, reviewing notes on her tablet. "The conservative factions, led by her cousin Zeth, oppose any expansion of relations with Earth. There have been incidents." "The intelligence briefs mentioned protests," George said. "Nothing violent yet." "Let's hope it stays that way." Hayes put away her tablet as their transport began to slow. "The princess believes our worlds have much to offer each other." I'm inclined to agree. The royal palace of Vixara rose before them, a massive structure of amber crystal and iridescent metal. As they approached the grand entrance, George felt a familiar tension settle between his shoulder blades, the sensation that had kept him alive through 3 wars back on Earth. Tonight would be a simple diplomatic function, but his instincts remained sharp. He had no way of knowing that before the night ended, his blood would be spilled on alien marble, and his fate would become irrevocably entwined with that of an alien princess. The great hall of Vixara hummed with conversation. Vexaran nobles in their traditional flowing robes mingled with Earth diplomats and representatives from 2 other spacefaring species that had established relations with Vixara. George maintained a position near Ambassador Hayes, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd, identifying exit security personnel and potential trouble spots. "Captain Jarrow." George acknowledged as the head of the Royal Guard approached. The Vexaran warrior was nearly 7 feet tall with the characteristic striped skin of his species. The markings on Jarrow's face and arms were particularly bold, a sign of high birth among the Vexaran. "Captain Sullivan," Jarrow replied with a formal nod. "My guards have secured all entrances. The princess will arrive shortly." "Your cooperation is appreciated," George said, keeping his tone neutral. Although they had worked together for several diplomatic events, Jarrow had never fully warmed to the human security team. Like many traditional Vexaran, he seemed to view the Earth Embassy with barely concealed suspicion. A subtle change in the atmosphere of the hall drew George's attention. Conversations quieted as all eyes turned toward the grand entrance. The royal announcer struck the ceremonial gong 3 times, its deep resonance filling the hall. Her Royal Highness Princess Alatha Vex-Terran, first daughter of the royal bloodkeeper, of the Sacred Flame, heir to the throne of Vexara. The princess entered, and George found himself momentarily transfixed. She was tall, even for a Vexaran with the characteristic lithe grace of her species. But, unlike the muted stripes of most Vexaran nobility, her skin bore striking patterns of gold and deep amber that seemed to shimmer in the hall's crystalline light. Her eyes, large, almond-shaped and a startling emerald green, surveyed the room with calm intelligence. She wore a formal robe of deep blue, embroidered with symbols of the royal house, and a simple circlet of silver marked her royal status. Ambassador Hayes moved forward for the formal greeting, George following at the proper distance. As they approached, he noticed subtle details. The princess's guards positioned throughout the room, the way certain Vexaran nobles watched her, with expressions ranging from adoration to barely concealed hostility, and the presence of several elder priests in their ceremonial attire. "Ambassador Hayes," the princess said, her voice melodious, even through the slight electronic buzz of the translation device she wore. "Your presence honors us." "The honor is ours, Your Highness," Hayes replied with a perfect formal bow. "May I present Captain George Sullivan, our embassy's security advisor." The princess turned her gaze to George, and he was struck by the intensity of her attention. He executed the proper bow that he had been drilled on repeatedly by the embassy's cultural attaché. "Captain," the princess acknowledged, "I understand you have been coordinating with Captain Jarrow. He speaks highly of your professionalism." George glanced at the stoic Vexaran guard captain, surprised by this information. "Captain Jarrow has been most cooperative, Your Highness." A subtle smile curved the princess's lips, and George had the distinct impression that she was aware of the tension between the two security teams. Before she could speak again, however, an elder priest approached his elaborate headdress, marking him as a high-ranking member of the traditional council. "Your Highness," the priest said, his tone formal, but with an undercurrent of disapproval. "The blessing for the gathering must begin." "Of course, Elder Vashi." The princess inclined her head respectfully. "Ambassador Captain, please enjoy the reception. We will speak more later." As the princess moved away, George returned to his security position. The reception proceeded according to plan, with formal speeches about cooperation and mutual benefit. George noted that Princess Alatha spoke passionately about the future, emphasizing the benefits of technological and cultural exchange. Several of the older nobles and priests looked distinctly uncomfortable during her speech, while others nodded in agreement. Ambassador Hayes was engaged in conversation with a group of Vexaran officials when George noticed a server approaching with a tray of the ceremonial drinking vessels used for formal toasts. Something about the server's movements triggered his combat instincts. A slight hesitation, eyes that scanned too deliberately, hands that gripped the tray too tightly. George began moving before his conscious mind had fully processed the threat. He saw the server's hand slip beneath the tray, emerging with a thin, curved blade that gleamed in the crystalline light. The blade was aimed directly at Princess Alatha, who stood with her back turned, engaged in conversation with Elder Vashi. "Assassin!" George shouted, already lunging forward. The distance was too great. He would never reach the princess in time. Captain Jarrow and his guards were reacting, but they too were positioned too far away. The assassin moved with unexpected speed, closing the distance to the princess. George abandoned protocol and training, vaulting over a decorative fountain, colliding with startled diplomats. He reached the princess just as the assassin struck, and without hesitation threw himself between the blade and its intended target. White-hot pain exploded across George's chest as the ceremonial blade sliced through his diplomatic uniform and deep into his flesh. He heard shouts, saw the blur of royal guards converging, felt the warm rush of his own blood. As he collapsed to the marble floor, his last sight was of Princess Alatha's startled green eyes, looking down at him, her expression shifting from shock to something like wonder. Then darkness claimed him. George drifted through fragments of consciousness. Voices, some speaking English, others in the musical language of the Vexarin. The antiseptic smell of a medical facility. Pain dulled by what must be powerful analgesics. And always returning in his fevered dreams, a pair of emerald eyes. When he finally awoke fully, he found himself in a chamber unlike any hospital room he had ever seen. The walls appeared to be made of living crystal that pulsed with a soft blue light. Medical equipment, some recognizably Earth-manufactured, others of alien design, surrounded his bed. Through a large window, he could see one of Vexara's moons, hanging low in an evening sky. "You're awake." The voice drew his attention to a figure seated nearby. Ambassador Hayes rose from her chair, looking simultaneously relieved and concerned. "How do you feel, Captain?" George attempted to sit up, only to be halted by a sharp pain across his chest. "Like I've been stabbed with an alien ceremonial dagger," he replied dryly. "What happened?" "You saved Princess Alatha's life." Hayes set her professional diplomat's mask, slipping, to reveal genuine admiration. "The assassin was apprehended, a member of an extremist faction opposed to relations with Earth. You've been unconscious for 3 days while the royal physicians treated your wounds." 3 days. George glanced around the room again, noting details he had missed initially. The elaborate decorations, the royal insignia on various items. "This doesn't look like an embassy medical facility." "It isn't," Hayes hesitated. "You're in the royal palace. Princess Alatha insisted you be treated by her personal physicians. Captain, there's something you need to understand." Before she could continue, the chamber door opened. Princess Alatha entered accompanied by Captain Jarrow and an older Vexarin female, dressed in elaborate ceremonial robes that marked her as a high priestess. George attempted to rise again this time, managing to push himself into a sitting position despite the pain. "Please do not strain yourself, Captain Sullivan," the princess said, moving to his bedside. Up close, the patterns on her skin were even more striking. Delicate whorls of gold against deep amber, unlike any markings he had seen on other Vexarin. "How are you feeling?" "I'll live, Your Highness," George replied. "Thank you for the medical care." The princess exchanged a glance with the priestess, then turned back to George. "You saved my life, Captain. You placed yourself between me and certain death with no thought for your own safety. Such an act. It has significance in our culture." George sensed a sudden tension in Ambassador Hayes's posture. "I was doing my duty, Your Highness." "More than duty," the priestess interjected, her voice carrying the weight of age and authority. "You have created a theasi with the princess, what your language might translate as a blood debt or life bond. It is one of our most sacred traditions." "I don't understand," George said, looking between the alien faces and Hayes's increasingly concerned expression. The princess sat gracefully in a chair beside his bed. "When one Vexarin saves another's life by risking their own, it creates a sacred bond between them. The one whose life was saved owes a debt that can never truly be repaid, but must be honored through a ritual process of connection." "What Ambassador Hayes was about to explain," the priestess continued, "is that you have initiated this bond with a member of the royal family, something that has not occurred with an off-worlder in our recorded history." George looked to Hayes for clarification. The ambassador stepped forward, her diplomatic training evident in her measured tone. "The princess and the high priestess Sirona have explained the situation to me. The theasi is considered binding under Vexarin law and tradition. It cannot be declined." "I don't recall agreeing to any binding alien customs," George said, carefully aware of the delicate situation. With all respect to your traditions, Your Highness, I was simply performing my duty as a security officer. The intention is irrelevant, Priestess Serona stated firmly. The blood has been spilled, the life preserved. The Thiassi exists, whether acknowledged or not. Captain Jarrow, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Many of the traditional council are disturbed by this development. An off-worlder bound to the royal heir. It is unprecedented. Yet it has happened, Princess Alatha said, her tone leaving no room for argument. And I will honor the traditions of our people. She turned her emerald gaze back to George. When you are sufficiently recovered, Captain Sullivan, the first stage of the Thiassi ritual must begin. Until then, rest and heal. With that, she rose and departed, followed by Jarrow and the priestess. Only Hayes remained, her expression troubled. What exactly does this ritual involve? George asked, once they were alone. Hayes sighed heavily. The embassy's cultural experts are researching it now. The Thiassi is rarely discussed with outsiders. What I do know is that it's a series of bonding rituals that usually last several months, designed to forge a connection between the lifesaver and the life saved. She paused. George, this is diplomatically complex. The princess is the heir to the throne. Her cousin Zeth and the conservative factions were already opposed to her pro-Earth policies. This incident has given them more ammunition, George finished. I understand. There's more, Hayes said reluctantly. During your treatment, the royal physicians discovered something unusual in your cellular response to their medications. Apparently, you have a rare genetic compatibility with Vexaran biology. It's part of why they were able to heal you so effectively. George absorbed this information, trying to make sense of his new reality. So what happens now? Now you rest and recover, Hayes said, rising from her chair. I've been ordered back to the embassy for consultations. The Earth government is concerned about these developments. After Hayes departed, George lay back against the pillows, staring at the alien ceiling. What had begun as a routine diplomatic assignment had suddenly become something far more complicated. He thought of the princess's striking appearance, her evident intelligence, and the weight of tradition that seemed to surround her. Whatever this Thiassi involved, he suspected his life on Vixara had just become vastly more interesting, and potentially more dangerous. The next week passed in a blur of medical examinations, diplomatic consultations, and cultural briefings. George learned that the assassin had been a member of a radical traditionalist group, secretly funded by members of the royal court, who opposed the princess's progressive policies. The attempt on her life had actually strengthened her political position, as many previously neutral nobles had rallied to her cause in the wake of such dishonorable tactics. As for George himself, he had become the subject of intense curiosity among the Vexaran. The palace staff treated him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Captain Jarrow, surprisingly, had become almost friendly, visiting daily to discuss security protocols, and increasingly to share stories of Vexaran military history. Your action was worthy of the ancient warriors, Jarrow admitted during one such visit. To place oneself between death and another without hesitation, it is the essence of honor in our traditions. On Earth, we call it doing your job, George replied, though he appreciated the growing rapport. When will I be allowed to return to the embassy? Jarrow's expression became guarded. That is complicated. The first ritual of Thiassi approaches. Traditionally, those bound by Thiassi remain in proximity until the bond is formalized. Before George could press for more details, the door opened to admit Ambassador Hayes. The ambassador had been shuttling between the palace and the embassy, managing the diplomatic implications of the situation. Captain. She greeted him, waiting until Jarrow had departed before continuing. I've received new instructions from Earth. Given the delicate nature of this situation and its potential impact on our relationship with Vexara, you are being temporarily reassigned. Reassigned to where? Here, Hayes said simply. Your new role is to fulfill whatever obligations this Thiassi entails, while reporting directly to me on all developments. The diplomatic corps sees this as an unprecedented opportunity to strengthen our alliance with Vexara through Princess Alatha. George felt a surge of discomfort. Am I being ordered to participate in alien bonding rituals for political advantage? Hayes's expression softened slightly. No one is ordering you to do anything beyond what is already necessary, George. The Thiassi exists, whether we like it or not. Your choice now is whether to embrace it grudgingly or willingly. She paused. For what it's worth, our xenoanthropologists believe the Thiassi is a profound honor in Vexaran culture. It's not a servitude or subjugation, but a mutual recognition of a life-changing connection. Before George could respond, a soft chime announced another visitor. This time, it was Princess Alatha herself, who entered without her usual entourage. She wore simpler attire than at the reception, a tunic and leggings of some iridescent material that highlighted the unique patterns of her skin. Ambassador Hayes, she acknowledged with a nod. Captain Sullivan, I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all, Your Highness, Hayes replied smoothly. I was just updating the captain on his new assignment. Ah, yes. Your government has agreed to the temporary posting. The princess seemed pleased. Captain, the royal physicians inform me that you are healing well. If you feel strong enough, the first ritual of Thiassi is traditionally performed within 10 days of the life-saving act. George sat up straighter, ignoring the twinge from his healing wound. I'm well enough, Your Highness, though I admit I'm still unclear on what exactly this ritual entails. The princess glanced at Hayes, who took the hint gracefully. I'll leave you to discuss the details, Your Highness, Captain. With a formal bow, the ambassador departed. Once alone with the princess, George felt a strange tension in the air. She moved to the window, gazing out at the capital city spread below. The Thiassi is not easily explained to outsiders, she began. It is not merely a debt or an obligation, but a recognition that when one life preserves another, those lives become connected in ways that transcend ordinary relationships. She turned to face him. The first ritual is called the proximity. For 3 days we must remain within sight of each other, sharing space meals and conversation. That seems straightforward enough, George said, somewhat relieved. A smile touched the princess's lips. It is the simplest of the rituals. Later ones are more involved, but we need not worry about those yet. She moved closer to his bed. Captain Sullivan. George, he interrupted, then added hastily, if we're going to spend 3 days in each other's company, Your Highness, perhaps you could use my given name. She considered this for a moment, then nodded. George, and in private you may call me Alatha, though in public protocol must be observed. She sat in the chair beside his bed. There is much you should know about the political situation you have become entangled in. Over the next hour, Alatha outlined the complex factions within the Vexaran court. Her cousin Zeth led the traditionalist faction that opposed any expanded relations with Earth or other worlds, fearing cultural contamination and loss of Vexaran identity. As the male cousin closest to the throne, he had long been considered by many traditionalists as a more suitable heir, despite Alatha's direct lineage. The attempt on my life was likely orchestrated by Zeth's supporters, though proving his direct involvement has been impossible, she explained. The Thiassi between us has created additional complications. Some see it as a desecration of sacred tradition, while others view it as fate's intervention. And what do you see it as? George asked directly. Alatha's emerald eyes held his for a long moment. An opportunity, she finally said, and perhaps a necessity. My world cannot remain isolated if it is to thrive. The Thiassi may be traditional, but it may also be the catalyst for the very changes I have been advocating. So I'm a political tool, George observed, keeping his tone neutral. We all serve purposes beyond our individual desires, Alatha replied. But the Thiassi is not meant to be coldly political. It is deeply personal, a true connection between lives. That is why the rituals cannot be performed falsely or half-heartedly. She rose from her chair. "Rest tonight, George Sullivan. Tomorrow we begin the proximity." After she departed, George lay back contemplating his strange new reality. He had come to Vexara as a security advisor, expecting routine diplomatic protection duties. Now, he found himself bound to an alien princess, by ancient traditions caught in the cross-currents of extraterrestrial politics, with Earth watching his every move for diplomatic advantage. And beneath it all, he could not deny a growing fascination with Princess Alatha herself. Her strength, her intelligence, and the vision she had for her world's future. The first ritual of proximity began the following morning. George was escorted to a suite of rooms within the royal palace. A sitting area, dining space, and meditation chamber, all connected to a garden terrace that overlooked the capital. The architecture was typical Vexaran, with organic curves and living crystal that responded to light and movement. Princess Alatha arrived shortly after, accompanied by Priestess Corona, who carried ceremonial items on a silver tray, 2 slender bracelets of an iridescent metal, and a crystal vial containing a deep amber liquid. The ritual of proximity begins with the binding, Corona explained. These bracelets will glow if you move beyond the prescribed distance from one another. The essence, she indicated the vial, is a mixture of waters from the sacred lakes of Vexara, blessed by the temple guardians. The ritual itself was simple. George and Alatha stood facing each other, while Corona recited prayers in the Vexaran language. They each drank from the vial, and then the bracelets were placed on their left wrists. As the final words were spoken, the bracelets briefly pulsed with a soft light. "It is begun," Corona announced. "For 3 cycles of the sun you must remain within sight of one another. The Thiasi demands this initial connection, this acknowledgement that your paths are now joined." With that she bowed formally and departed, leaving George alone with the princess. An awkward silence fell between them. Despite his military training and diplomatic experience, George found himself at a loss for how to proceed. It was Alatha who finally broke the tension. "I have arranged for various activities during our proximity," she said, moving to a table where a star chart was displayed in 3 dimensions above its surface. "I thought you might appreciate learning more about Vexara and its place in this sector of space." The first day passed in such educational pursuits. Alatha proved to be a knowledgeable guide to her world's history, culture, and scientific achievements. George found himself genuinely interested, asking questions that went beyond mere politeness. For her part, the princess seemed equally curious about Earth, pressing him for details about his homeworld's diverse cultures and turbulent history. They dined together on the terrace as Vexara's sun set, casting the city in amber light. The conversation had grown more comfortable, though George remained acutely aware of the unusual nature of their situation. "May I ask you something personal?" he ventured as they finished their meal. Alatha inclined her head in permission. "The markings on your skin, they're different from other Vexaran I've seen. More pronounced, more intricate." A slight smile curved her lips. "You are observant. Yes, the royal lineage carries distinctive patterns. Mine are particularly pronounced, a sign of the strength of the bloodline according to tradition." She ran a finger along one of the golden whorls that traced her forearm. "They are called Shirvex, the tiger's blessing. In our ancient history, the royal family was said to have made a pact with the great predators of our world." "They're beautiful," George said honestly. Alatha looked momentarily surprised, then pleased. "Thank you. Few off-worlders comment on them. I think many find our appearance too alien for such observations." As night fell, servants prepared separate sleeping chambers on either side of the main sitting room. Though they were required to remain within sight during waking hours, the proximity allowed for privacy during sleep, so long as the doors remained open enough for the bracelets to maintain their connection. The second day brought a different kind of education. Captain Jarrow arrived in the morning, and to George's surprise, a training session had been arranged in the palace's martial arts chamber. "The Thiasi often includes the sharing of skills," Alatha explained, as they walked to the training area. "As warriors, it seemed appropriate. The session proved fascinating. George demonstrated earth combat techniques, while Jero and Alatha showed him the fundamentals of Vexaran martial arts, a fluid dance-like style that utilized their natural speed and flexibility. Despite his still healing wound, George found the physical activity invigorating after days of bed rest. "You move well for a human," Jero commented with what George had come to recognize as reluctant approval. "The princess chose wisely when she accepted your Thiaci." "I didn't exactly give her a choice," George pointed out. "There is always choice," Alatha interjected, toweling moisture from her face after an impressive demonstration with Jero. "I could have acknowledged the life debt, but requested a modification of the traditional Thiaci, given your off-world status. But I chose the full tradition." This revelation stayed with George throughout the day. During their afternoon meal, he finally addressed it directly. "Why did you choose the full tradition? Surely it would have been politically expedient to minimize the connection." Alatha considered him for a long moment before answering. "There were several reasons. First, it demonstrates my commitment to our traditions, even as I advocate for change. Second, it creates a precedent for meaningful connections between our peoples." She paused. "And third, I sensed something in you, George Sullivan, something that resonated with my own path. The Thiaci does not create connections where none could exist. It merely formalizes bonds that were already possible." The evening of the second day found them in quiet conversation on the terrace. The formality between them had gradually dissolved, replaced by a growing comfort and genuine interest. George found himself sharing stories from his military career, the camaraderie, the losses, the reasons he had eventually transitioned to diplomatic security. "You seek to protect rather than destroy," Alatha observed. "That is a worthy evolution for a warrior." "And you," George asked, "what drives your desire for change on Vexara?" "It would be easier to maintain traditions to not challenge the established order." Alatha's gaze turned to the city, stretching below them, the lights of Vexara twinkling like earthbound stars. "When I was young, I spent a year in the temple school, as all royal children must. There, I discovered ancient texts that spoke of Vexara's early contact with other worlds centuries before our modern space age. Those contacts brought knowledge, art, medicine, until the Great Isolation was decreed after a particularly devastating war." She turned back to George, her expression intense. "We lost 5 centuries of potential growth because of fear. When space travel was rediscovered and contact with other worlds renewed, those same fears resurfaced. I believe Vexara has much to offer the galaxy, and much to learn. Isolation breeds stagnation, George. I will not see my world wither because of antiquated fears." The passion in her voice struck George deeply. Here was no naive idealist, but a leader with a clear vision for her people's future. He found himself admiring her conviction, and increasingly drawn to her as an individual, not merely as an alien princess or diplomatic assignment. The third day of proximity brought the most personal exchanges yet. Following tradition, they shared stories of their childhoods, their formative experiences, their moments of triumph and failure. Alatha described the intense pressure of being the sole female heir in generations, the scrutiny and criticism she had endured from traditionalists, and her determination to prove herself worthy of leadership. George, in turn, spoke of growing up in a military family, the expectations that had shaped his career choices, and the combat experiences that had ultimately led him to seek a different path. He found himself revealing thoughts and feelings he had rarely shared with anyone. Something about the ritual, and about Alatha herself, seemed to invite openness. As sunset approached on the final day, Priestess Sirona returned to conclude the ritual. She led them in a ceremony that involved the mixing of sacred oils and the recitation of ancient vows. The bracelets were removed, though George noted that the faint impression where his had rested seemed to shimmer slightly in certain light. "The first ritual is complete," Sirona announced. "The bond of proximity has been established. You may now move separately, though the Thiaci remains active between you." After the priestess departed, George and Alatha stood awkwardly in the sitting room that had been their shared space for 3 days. "What happens now?" George asked. "Now we return to our duties," Alatha replied. "You to the embassy, I to court matters. But the second ritual must begin within 30 days. It is called the unveiling of truths." She hesitated. "It is more intimate than the proximity." "In what way?" "It involves a journey to the ancestral temple where we must share our deepest truths, under the influence of the sacred mists. The Thiasi demands honesty between those it binds." She met his gaze directly. "It can be revealing." George absorbed this information, uncertain how to respond. The growing connection he felt to Alatha confused him. Was it merely the effect of the ritual, or something more genuine? Before he could formulate a reply, a palace attendant arrived with an urgent message for the princess. "Zeth has called for a meeting of the royal council," she said, after reading it, her expression darkening. "He rarely involves himself in governance unless he sees opportunity for advancement." "Do you want me to accompany you?" George asked. Alatha shook her head. "Not this time. Politics within the royal council are delicate, and your presence might be seen as provocative." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Ambassador Hayes has requested your return to the embassy for debriefing. We will speak again soon, George Sullivan." With that, she was gone, leaving George to contemplate the strange turns his life had taken. 3 days of constant proximity to an alien princess had left him with more questions than answers, about Vexaran politics, about the mysterious Thiasi, and about his own unexpected feelings. The embassy debriefing was extensive. Ambassador Hayes, along with the cultural attaché and the embassy's xenoanthropologist, interviewed George for hours about every aspect of the proximity ritual. He provided detailed accounts, while omitting some of the more personal conversations between himself and Alatha. "The diplomatic corps is viewing this as a potential breakthrough," Hayes informed him after the formal debriefing concluded. "No human has ever participated in a Thiasi before. The fact that the princess chose to follow the full traditional ritual rather than a modified version suggests she sees strategic value in the connection. Or she's simply honoring her cultural traditions." George countered, somewhat irritated by the ambassador's purely political interpretation. Hayes gave him a penetrating look. "You've come to admire her." It wasn't a question. George chose his words carefully. "She's intelligent, dedicated to her people's welfare, and courageous in pursuing her vision despite opposition. Those are admirable qualities in any leader." "Just be careful to maintain perspective, Captain," Hayes advised. "Remember that however personal this Thiasi may feel, it exists within a complex political context. Princess Alatha is first and foremost the heir to the Vexaran throne." Over the next 2 weeks, George resumed his duties at the embassy, while regularly receiving updates on palace activities. Zeth had indeed been maneuvering politically, questioning the propriety of the Thiasi, and suggesting that Alatha's judgment had been compromised by her progressive views. Several traditionalist nobles had rallied to his position, though the majority of the royal council remained loyal to the princess. George was permitted to attend one formal court function, where he observed the political dynamics firsthand. Zeth was a striking figure, tall, even for a Vexaran, with sharp features, and the muted striping pattern common to the royal lineage, though lacking the distinctive golden whorls of Alatha's markings. He treated George with exaggerated courtesy that barely concealed his contempt. "The human who saved our princess," Zeth remarked during a brief conversation. "Vexara owes you a debt, Captain Sullivan, though some might question whether such a debt should be formalized through our most sacred traditions." "Your cultural practices are for your people to determine, Lord Zeth," George replied diplomatically. "I'm merely following the protocols established by your religious authorities." Zeth's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed. And soon you will participate in the unveiling of truths. Fascinating that an off-worlder will enter the ancestral temple, a place many Vexaran nobles have never been permitted to visit. The implied criticism was clear, and George noted several nearby nobles watching the exchange with interest. Before he could respond, Alatha appeared at his side. "Cousin," she greeted Zeth with formal correctness. "I see you've met Captain Sullivan properly at last." "A most illuminating conversation," Zeth replied with a thin smile. "I look forward to hearing the outcome of the second ritual. The unveiling often reveals unexpected insights." With a formal bow, he moved away to join a group of elder nobles. "He's testing the waters," Alatha murmured, once Zeth was out of earshot. "Gauging reactions to his opposition." "He seems to have significant support," George observed. "Among certain factions, yes, but not enough to challenge me directly." Alatha's expression was determined. "Not yet, at least." 2 days later, George received a formal summons. The second ritual of the Thiasi would begin the following morning. He was to pack minimal belongings for a 3-day journey to the ancestral temple in the mountains north of Vixara. Ambassador Hayes called him to her office upon learning of the summons. "Our intelligence suggests that Zeth may be planning something around this ritual," she informed him. "The journeys to the ancestral temple are traditionally undertaken without military escort. Only temple guardians are permitted to accompany participants." "You think there might be an attack?" "We can't rule it out," Hayes said grimly. "The first assassination attempt failed. Zeth may see this as another opportunity, particularly given the remote location." "I'll be on guard," George assured her. "And I'm not without resources even without weapons. We've arranged for emergency extraction if necessary," Hayes said, sliding a small device across her desk. "This beacon will penetrate even the mountain rock. Use it only in extreme circumstances. Violating the sanctity of the temple journey would have serious diplomatic repercussions." George tucked the device into his pocket, hoping he wouldn't need it. The journey began before dawn. George met Princess Alatha at the eastern gate of the palace, where a small procession had gathered. The princess wore simple traveling attire, a tunic and leggings of muted color, with only a small silver circlet to denote her royal status. 4 temple guardians in ceremonial armor stood ready to escort them along with Priestess Sirona, who would conduct the ritual. "The journey to the temple is itself part of the Thiasi," Sirona explained as they departed the city. "The path represents the connection being forged between you, sometimes smooth, sometimes difficult, but always moving forward together." Their transport took them out of the capital and into the foothills of the Vexara mountain range. As they ascended, the landscape changed dramatically, the cultivated fields giving way to wild forests of silver-leaf trees and strange spiral-shaped plants that twisted toward the rising sun. By midday, they had reached the point where even Vexaran vehicles could go no further. The remainder of the journey would be on foot, along ancient paths cut into the mountainside. George eyed the steep trail with a professional assessment, easily defensible in places, but with numerous blind curves that could conceal potential threats. The temple guardians took up positions around Alatha, with George walking beside her. Priestess Corona led the way, occasionally stopping to point out sacred landmarks or to perform small rituals at wayside shrines. "These mountains are the birthplace of our civilization," Alatha told George as they climbed. "The first Vexaran emerged from caves high above, according to our creation myths. The ancestral temple was built on the site, where the ancient tribal leaders formed the first united kingdom." "How much of that is history, and how much mythology?" George asked. "Archaeological evidence supports much of it," Alatha replied. "Though the myths speak of the first Vexaran being born from the union of lightning and stone, which seems rather more poetic than factual." Her lips curved in a smile. "Not unlike some Earth creation myths, I imagine." As they ascended higher, George found himself impressed with Alatha's stamina. Despite her royal upbringing, she showed no signs of fatigue, even as the air grew thinner and the path more challenging. "All royal children undergo wilderness training," she explained, when he commented on it. "Our ancestors were warriors and hunters before they were rulers. The tradition continues." They made camp as night fell, the temperature dropping rapidly with the setting sun. The temple guardians erected simple shelters and established a perimeter, while Priestess Sirona prepared a meal of traditional traveling foods: dried fruits, a bread-like substance, and a hot spiced beverage that George found surprisingly pleasant. As they sat around the small heating unit that served as their campfire, George found himself studying the guardian captain, a stoic Vexaran named Tarn. Something about the warrior's movements struck him as oddly familiar, though he couldn't place why. "Is something troubling you, Captain Sullivan?" Sirona asked, noticing his scrutiny. "Not troubling exactly," George replied carefully. "I was just observing Captain Tarn's technique as he secured the perimeter. It seemed distinctive." Olathe and Sirona exchanged glances. "Captain Tarn was personally selected by my cousin Zeth to lead the temple guardians for this journey," Olathe said quietly. "An unusual choice, as Zeth rarely involves himself in temple matters." The implication was clear. George nodded slightly to indicate his understanding. He would need to remain vigilant. The night passed without incident, though George slept lightly alert to any unusual sounds. They resumed their journey at first light, the path growing steeper and more rugged. By midday, they had reached a plateau high in the mountains, where a breathtaking vista spread before them. The capital city visible in the far distance, a glittering jewel nestled among the amber fields of the lowlands. "We are nearly there," Sirona announced. "The temple lies just beyond the ridge ahead. Before we proceed, we must perform the cleansing." The cleansing ritual involved washing hands and face in water collected from a mountain spring, followed by the burning of aromatic herbs. As the fragrant smoke wafted around them, George felt a strange lightness, as though the air itself had become more rarefied. The herbs helped prepare the mind for the unveiling, Sirona explained, noticing his reaction. They enhance perception and open the pathways of truth. The ancestral temple itself was unlike anything George had expected. Rather than a constructed building, it was a massive cave entrance, its natural archway enhanced with ancient carvings that glowed with a soft, phosphorescent light. As they approached, George could feel a subtle vibration in the air, almost like a low hum, just below the threshold of hearing. The sacred mists of the temple are produced by underwater geothermal vents deep within the mountain, Olathe explained in a hushed voice. They have unique properties that our scientists have studied for generations. Captain Tarn and his guards took up positions outside the entrance. Only Sirona would accompany them into the temple itself. Before they entered, the priestess prepared them with final instructions. The unveiling of truths requires complete honesty. The sacred mists will make deception difficult, even painful. You will be guided to the central chamber where you will remain for one full day and night. There you will share truths that have shaped your lives, your fears, your hopes. She fixed her gaze on George. For an off-worlder, this experience can be disorienting. Focus on the princess. She will be your anchor. With that, they entered the temple. The temperature dropped immediately, and George felt moisture on his skin as they moved deeper into the mountain. The passageway was illuminated by the same phosphorescent carvings he had seen at the entrance, casting everything in a ghostly blue-green light. The central chamber was a vast domed space with a pool of still dark water at its center. Mist rose constantly from the water's surface, filling the chamber with a swirling haze that seemed to glow from within. Stone benches encircled the pool, worn smooth by centuries of use. Sirona directed them to sit facing each other across the pool. She performed a series of rituals, lighting sacred oils in stone dishes, reciting ancient prayers in the old Vexaran tongue, and finally sprinkling a powder into the pool that caused the mist to momentarily flare with a golden light. "The unveiling has begun," she intoned. "I will return when the sun has completed one full cycle. Until then, the Thiasi demands truth between you." With that, she departed, leaving George and Olathe alone in the misty chamber. For several minutes they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle lapping of the pool and their own breathing. George felt the mist entering his lungs with each breath, bringing a strange clarity to his thoughts, even as the physical world seemed to grow slightly less substantial. "Who begins?" he finally asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "The one who saved must speak first." Alatha replied, her voice equally ethereal in the mist-filled chamber. "It is tradition." George took a deep breath, feeling the mist swirl within him. "What kind of truth am I meant to share?" "Begin with why you truly placed yourself between me and the assassin's blade," Alatha suggested. "Beyond duty or obligation." The question penetrated to the core of George's being. Under the influence of the mist, he found himself answering with a frankness that surprised him. "I've spent my life protecting others, first as a soldier, then as a security officer. But much of that was about proving myself, living up to family expectations, following orders." He paused, feeling the mist compelling him toward deeper honesty. "When I saw the blade, there was no calculation, no thought of duty or consequences. Only the certainty that I could not allow harm to come to you. Not just because you were a diplomatic principal, but because in the brief time I had observed you, I recognized something worth preserving. A vision, a strength that this world needs." The words hung in the misty air between them. Alatha's emerald eyes seemed to glow in the strange light of the chamber. "And now," she asked softly, "after coming to know me through the proximity—" "Now I know I was right," George said simply. "You are something exceptional, Alatha. Not just a princess or a political leader, but a person of rare courage and conviction. I would take that blade again without hesitation." Alatha's expression softened, and in the swirling mist, George could see emotions playing across her features with unusual clarity. Surprise, gratitude, and something more complex that he couldn't quite name. "Now it is my turn to speak truth," she said. "When you fell before me, your human blood spilling on our sacred marble, I felt something I had never experienced before, a connection that transcended the formal bonds of duty and position. The Thiassi was traditionally invoked, yes, but I embraced it not out of obligation, but because I sensed that our paths were meant to converge." She leaned forward, the mist swirling between them. "I have been alone my entire life, George Sullivan. Surrounded by courtiers and counselors, yes, but isolated by my position, my gender, my vision for Vexara's future. In you, I sensed a kindred spirit, someone who understands duty, but sees beyond it to something greater." The hours passed in this manner, truth following truth in a deepening exchange that seemed to exist outside of normal time. Under the influence of the sacred mists, they shared formative experiences, personal failings, private hopes, and unspoken fears. George spoke of combat experiences he had never fully processed, of friends lost in distant wars, of his growing disillusionment with military solutions. Alatha revealed the pressure of being the sole female heir, in generations, the assassination attempts that had begun when she was just a child, and her determination to transform Vexaran society despite the personal cost. As night fell, bringing deeper darkness to the temple chamber, their truths became more intimate still. The mist seemed to intensify with the darkness breaking down the final barriers between them. "I fear that I will fail my people," Alatha confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That Szeth and the traditionalists will prevail, condemning Vexara to isolation and eventual decline." "You won't fail," George said with quiet certainty. "You possess what Szeth lacks, genuine concern for your people's welfare, not just your own power." "And what do you fear, George Sullivan?" The mist compelled his answer, before he could consider its implications. "I fear that when this is over, when the Thiassi is complete, I will be sent back to Earth, back to a life that now seems hollow by comparison." Alatha's eyes widened slightly. "You would wish to remain on Vexara?" "I would wish to remain where I can make a difference," George replied, "where my service has meaning. And yes, where you are." The admission hung between them, too honest to retract, too significant to ignore. In the swirling mist, George saw Alatha move around the pool, until she stood before him. She extended her hand, the distinctive patterns of her skin glowing faintly in the phosphorescent light. "The Thiasi creates bonds that cannot be severed," she said softly. "Whatever comes, George Sullivan, you will not be cast aside when it is complete." She sat beside him on the stone bench, their shoulders touching. The contact sent a strange energy through George, as though the connection between them had suddenly become tangible. Whether it was the effect of the mists or something more profound, he couldn't say. They continued sharing truths through the night, their voices growing softer, their words more intimate. As dawn approached, a final unspoken truth hovered between them, a growing affection that transcended diplomatic relations or cultural curiosity. When Priestess Sirona returned at daybreak, she found them sitting side by side, their hands intertwined, surrounded by the golden mist that now filled the chamber. "The unveiling is complete," she announced, after performing the closing rituals. "The Thiasi grows stronger between you." As they emerged from the temple into the clear mountain air, George felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. The experience had been unlike anything in his past, more intimate than any human relationship he had known, yet still wrapped in the mystery of cross-cultural differences. Captain Tarn and his guardians awaited them, and George noticed immediately that something had changed. The captain's stance was more rigid, his expression guarded. The other guardians positioned themselves differently than before, subtly placing themselves between Alatha and the path back to the capital. "Is something wrong, Captain Tarn?" Alatha asked also, sensing the shift. "News from the capital, Your Highness." Tarn replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Lord Zeth has called an emergency session of the Royal Council in your absence. There are allegations of impropriety regarding the Thiasi." Alatha's expression hardened. "What allegations?" "It is not my place to say, Your Highness, but Lord Zeth insisted that you return immediately upon completion of the ritual." George caught Alatha's eye, a silent communication passing between them, a newfound ability fostered by their time in the mists. Something was wrong. The positioning of the guards, Tarn's careful phrasing, the tension in the air. This was not merely a diplomatic summons. "Of course," Alatha said smoothly. "We shall depart at once. Priestess Corona, will you lead the blessing for our return journey?" As Sirona began the ritual, George casually adjusted his position, placing himself closer to Alatha while scanning their surroundings. The beacon that Hayes had given him was secure in his pocket, but using it would be a last resort. Whatever Zeth had planned, they would need to handle it themselves. The descent from the temple was tense, with conversation kept to formal pleasantries. George observed that their path seemed different than their ascent, less exposed, but with more confined spaces, where an ambush would be effective. His combat instincts, honed through years of military service, were on high alert. The attack came in a narrow ravine, where sheer rock walls rose on either side of the path. One moment they were walking in formation, the next, the air was filled with the distinctive whine of Vexaran energy weapons powering up. "Ambush!" George shouted, lunging toward Alatha as the first shot struck the ground where she had been standing. Captain Tarn and two of his guardians had drawn their weapons, not to defend against attackers, but pointed directly at the princess. "By order of Lord Zeth, heir apparent to the throne of Vixara, you are detained for treason against our sacred traditions," Tarn announced. The fourth guardian hesitated, looking conflicted, while Priestess Corona stood frozen in shock. George had positioned himself in front of Alatha, assessing their options rapidly. The ravine walls offered few escape routes, and they were outnumbered and outarmed. "Lower your weapons," Alatha commanded, her voice carrying the full authority of her position. "This action is itself treasonous, Captain Tarn." "The true treason was inviting an off-worlder into our most sacred rituals," Tarn replied. "Lord Zeth has evidence that you have compromised Vexaran security through your association with this human." More attackers appeared on the ravine ridges above, at least 6 additional guards loyal to Zeth. They were thoroughly trapped. "What evidence?" George demanded, buying time as he calculated their odds. Tarn smiled coldly. It will be presented at your trial. For now, you will both accompany us back to the capital, under arrest, rather than as honored participants." George felt Alatha's hand brush against his back. A signal. During their time in the temple, they had shared not just personal truths, but professional knowledge. He had described Earth military tactics. She had explained Vexaran combat techniques. Now, without words, he understood her intent. "Very well," Alatha said, stepping forward with regal calm. "If this is how Szeth wishes to proceed, we shall face these false accusations properly." As she moved, George noted her subtle weight shift. The preparatory stance of the Vexaran martial technique she had demonstrated during their proximity ritual. He mirrored her movement, readying himself. The hesitant fourth guardian had lowered his weapon slightly, his expression troubled. It was all the opening they needed. "Now!" Alatha shouted, dropping to the ground as George launched himself at Captain Tarn. What followed was a blur of coordinated action. George's military training combined with the Vexaran techniques Alatha had shown him allowed him to disarm Tarn with surprising effectiveness. The captain, not expecting a human to know Vexaran combat moves, was unprepared for the counterattack. Alatha, meanwhile, had rolled toward the conflicted guardian, coming up with his dropped weapon and firing rapidly at the attackers on the ridge. Her marksmanship was impeccable, disabling rather than killing, but removing them from the fight nonetheless. Priestess Sirona, proving herself far from helpless, had produced a small, ceremonial blade from within her robes and engaged one of the treacherous guardians. "Defilers of the sacred journey!" she cried, as she fought with unexpected skill. The battle was brief, but fierce. When it ended, Captain Tarn and his co-conspirators lay subdued or unconscious. The hesitant guardian, whose name was Krell, had ultimately sided with the princess after witnessing Tarn's treachery. "Your Highness," Krell said, kneeling before Alatha, "I was told this was a security precaution, that there was intelligence suggesting an Earth plot against you. I never agreed to treason. Rise, Guardian Krell." Alatha said, her voice stern but not unkind. "Your hesitation likely saved our lives. Now tell me exactly what Szeth has been planning." From Krell's account, the picture became clear. Szeth had used the princess's absence during the temple journey to present fabricated evidence to the royal council, documents suggesting that Earth was using George and the Thiassi to manipulate Vixara's succession. According to Szeth's narrative, George was not merely a security officer, but a specialized agent sent to influence the princess through the sacred bond. "The council is divided," Krell reported. "Some believe Szeth's evidence, others suspect manipulation. But he has called for a right of succession, a formal challenge to your position as heir." "We need to return to the capital immediately," Alatha said grimly, "before Szeth can consolidate his position." They secured the traitorous guardians and commandeered their transport vehicle. As they sped toward the capital, George contacted Ambassador Hayes, using the secure communication device he carried. "The situation has escalated," he reported succinctly. "Szeth has attempted to have the princess arrested on false charges and has challenged her succession rights. We're en route to the capital now, but we'll need diplomatic support." "Understood," Hayes replied. "I've already received reports of unusual activity at the palace. The Earth Embassy has formally requested clarification from the Royal Council regarding these events. We're mobilizing what support we can, but treading carefully to avoid appearing to interfere in Vexaran succession matters." "We'll need more than diplomatic notes," George said flatly. "Szeth has crossed the line into violence." "Agreed. Security teams are on standby. What's your plan?" George glanced at Alatha, who was deep in conversation with Priestess Sirona. "The princess needs to appear before the Royal Council immediately to counter Szeth's claims. We'll head directly to the palace." "Be careful, George," Hayes cautioned. "This has implications beyond your personal connection to the princess." "I'm well aware, Ambassador," he replied. "Sullivan out." As they neared the capital, they could see unusual activity. Increased security at the city gates, military vehicles moving through the streets. News of the power struggle had clearly spread. Zeth controls the main palace entrance, Alatha said, studying reports on a communications device provided by Guardian Krell. But there are other ways in. The sacred tunnels beneath the temple district connect to the palace, a route used by royalty in times of crisis for generations. The plan formed quickly. They would split up. Sirona and Krell would create a distraction at the main temple, claiming to have urgent news from the ancestral temple, while George and Alatha would use the secret passages to enter the palace and reach the royal council chamber. The council session begins at sunset, Alatha explained, as they navigated the crowded streets, using a civilian transport to avoid detection. According to tradition, if I do not appear to answer the challenge, Zeth's claim gains legitimacy. We have less than 2 hours. The temple district was less heavily guarded than the palace itself, allowing them to slip into the main temple without incident. As Sirona and Krell departed to create their diversion, Alatha led George to a hidden doorway, behind an ancient statue of a Vexaran warrior. Few know of these passages, she explained, as they descended a narrow staircase. They were created during the last great civil war nearly 500 years ago. The tunnels were illuminated by the same phosphorescent material George had seen in the ancestral temple, casting everything in an eerie blue-green glow. They moved swiftly, Alatha navigating the labyrinth with practiced ease. "You've used these before," George observed. Alatha nodded. "As a child, I explored every corner of the palace and its surroundings. My tutors thought I was studying in the library." A smile flickered across her face despite the gravity of their situation. "I was studying, just not what they assigned." After nearly an hour of navigating the winding passages, they reached a vertical shaft with ancient handholds carved into the stone. "This leads to the royal quarters," Alatha whispered. "From there we can reach the council chamber through the private royal entrance." They climbed in silence, emerging through a concealed panel, in what appeared to be a private meditation room. Alatha moved to a cabinet and opened it, revealing ceremonial robes. "I must appear before the council in proper royal attire," she explained, selecting a robe of deep crimson with gold embroidery. "It will take only a moment." While she changed behind a privacy screen, George examined the room for weapons or tools that might prove useful. He found a ceremonial dagger that, while decorative, had a serviceable edge. When Alatha emerged, George was momentarily struck by her transformation. The simple traveling clothes had been replaced by the full regalia of the royal heir. The crimson robe flowing around her tall frame, a more elaborate silver circlet on her brow, and a ceremonial sash that bore the insignia of her lineage. She had also retrieved a small energy weapon, which she concealed within the folds of her robe. "You look," George began, but words failed him. "Like a heir prepared to defend her birthright." Alatha finished for him, a fierce determination in her eyes. "Come, we must hurry." They moved through the royal quarters, encountering no guards. An unexpected stroke of luck that Alatha explained was due to tradition. During succession challenges, the royal guards are all stationed in the council chamber to prevent interference. Zeth would not expect me to be within the palace already. They reached a small antechamber that Alatha identified as the royal entrance to the council chamber. Through the ornate door, they could hear voices raised in formal debate. The succession challenge was already underway. "Wait until I give the signal," Alatha instructed, her hand on the door. "When I call for witness, you will enter." "Alatha," George said quietly, catching her arm. "Whatever happens in there, the things we shared in the temple were truth." Her emerald eyes softened for a moment. "I know George Sullivan. That truth gives me strength now." She straightened her shoulders, her expression becoming regal and composed. "It is time." The door swung open and Princess Alatha stepped into the royal council chamber with perfect timing, just as Zeth was declaring her absence as proof of her unworthiness. The assembled nobles and elders gasped as she strode confidently to the center of the circular chamber. "I believe you speak of me, cousin," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. As you can see, I am very much present to answer your challenge. From his position at the antechamber door, George could see the entire council chamber. It was a vast, circular space with tiered seating for the nobles and elders. At the far end sat an ornate throne currently empty, a symbol that succession was under debate. Zeth stood on a speaker's platform dressed in formal attire that mimicked royal regalia without quite crossing into presumption. Princess Alatha. Zeth recovered quickly, his surprise masked by a diplomatic smile. Your arrival is unexpected. We had reports that you had been detained for questioning regarding certain treasonous activities. The only treason committed was by your agent's cousin, Alatha replied calmly. Captain Tarn and his conspirators have been apprehended after attempting to assassinate me during my return from the ancestral temple. Murmurs rippled through the assembled council. Zeth's expression darkened momentarily before he regained his composure. Serious allegations, cousin. Yet they conveniently distract from the evidence I have presented to the council regarding your entanglement with the human representative. Zeth gestured to a display hovering above the central table, showing documents and images. Evidence that suggests this Thiaci is not a sacred bond, but a calculated manipulation. You speak of evidence, Alatha said, her voice hardening. Let us examine it thoroughly. I call for witness. This was George's cue. He stepped through the doorway into the council chamber, causing another ripple of surprise among the assembled nobles. He wore no formal attire, still dressed in the simple traveling clothes from the temple journey, with visible signs of the recent combat, a stark contrast to the ceremonial splendor of the chamber. The human participant in the Thiaci, Zeth observed with barely concealed disdain. How convenient that he accompanies you, princess. Elder Vashi, head of the traditional council, rose from his seat. This is most irregular. The succession challenge is a matter for Vexaran nobility, not off-worlders. The challenge centers on the validity of the Thiaci, Alatha countered. Captain Sullivan is not here as an Earth representative, but as the other half of the bond in question. His testimony is directly relevant. The elder hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The witness may speak, but only to matters of the Thiaci. George stepped forward, standing beside Alatha before the council. Honorable members of the Royal Council, he began, keeping his voice steady and formal. I have completed both the ritual of proximity and the unveiling of truths with Princess Alatha. I can attest that the Thiaci between us is genuine, undertaken in accordance with your sacred traditions. Pretty words, Zeth interjected. Yet we have documentation indicating your assignment to Vexara was specifically engineered to create this situation. He gestured to the hovering display. Communication records between Earth officials discussing the strategic advantage of having one of their own bonded to the Vexaran heir. George studied the displayed documents, immediately recognizing sophisticated forgeries. These are fabrications, he stated flatly. I was assigned to the Earth Embassy 6 months ago as part of a routine security rotation. My personnel records can verify this. Conveniently untraceable claims, Zeth replied dismissively. Meanwhile, we have the unprecedented situation of an off-worlder participating in our most sacred rituals, gaining influence over our future ruler, all while his government pushes for expanded access to our resources and technology. The chamber had grown tense, with council members exchanging troubled glances. George could see that some were swayed by Zeth's arguments, while others appeared skeptical but uncertain. It was Priestess Sirona who changed the dynamic, entering through the main chamber doors with Guardian Krell at her side. The priestess looked imposing in her formal regalia, her expression severe as she approached the central platform. The temple speaks, she announced, using the formal phrase that demanded immediate attention from all present. I, Priestess Sirona, Guardian of the Sacred Mists, have witnessed a grave desecration of our traditions. What is the meaning of this interruption? Zeth demanded, though he had no authority to challenge a high priestess. The temple speaks, Elder Vashi confirmed, granting Sirona the floor. I have witnessed Lord Zeth's agents attempt to murder the royal heir during her return from the ancestral temple, Sirona declared, her voice ringing through the chamber. I have heard Captain Tarn confess that he acted on Lord Zeth's direct orders to prevent Princess Alatha from returning to counter his false claims. Guardian Krell stepped forward. I confirm the priestess's account. Lord Zeth ordered us to detain the princess and the human by any means necessary. Had they resisted, which he suggested they would, we were to eliminate them and claim self-defense. The council erupted in shocked exclamations. Zeth's face contorted with rage and panic. These are lies, a conspiracy between the priestess and the princess to maintain their hold on power. The sacred mists of the ancestral temple compel truth. Corona responded calmly. Would you submit to the unveiling Lord Zeth to prove your innocence? Zeth hesitated visibly, calculating his options. That moment of hesitation damned him in the eyes of many council members. Ambassador Hayes chose this moment to make her entrance accompanied by Captain Jarrow and a contingent of royal guards who had evidently sided with the princess. Forgive the interruption, Hayes announced formally. The Earth Embassy has completed an analysis of the documents presented by Lord Zeth. We have conclusive evidence that they are forgeries created using techniques that are inconsistent with Earth documentation protocols. She handed a data crystal to Elder Vashi. This contains our analysis along with authenticated copies of Captain Sullivan's actual assignment records. They clearly show that his posting was routine, predating any interaction with Princess Alatha. The evidence was damning, but Zeth was not ready to concede. This proves nothing. The human and the princess have completed the unveiling together. Who knows what plots they hatched in the sacred mists? Our traditions are clear. The royal blood must remain pure, untainted by off-world influence. Our traditions also prohibit false witness and treasonous acts against the rightful heir. Elder Vashi replied, his expression grave. The evidence against you mounts Lord Zeth. Sensing the council turning against him, Zeth made a desperate move. He drew a concealed weapon, a small but lethal energy pistol, and aimed it directly at Alatha. If tradition will not protect Vexara, then I must, he declared. George reacted, instantly positioning himself before Alatha, but it was unnecessary. Captain Jarrow had anticipated the move and fired first, his shot precisely disabling Zeth's weapon without harming the noble himself. Royal guards surrounded Zeth immediately, forcing him to his knees before the council. Treason in the sacred chamber, Elder Vashi intoned solemnly. The gravest of offenses. The council will deliberate on Lord Zeth's fate, Alatha declared, her voice steady despite the attempt on her life. But first we must resolve the succession challenge. She turned to face the assembled nobles and elders. I stand before you as the rightful heir, bonded by Thiassi to Captain George Sullivan of Earth. This bond was not sought for political advantage, but emerged from a sincere act of sacrifice. I believe it represents the future I envision for Vexara, one where tradition and progress exist in harmony, where we engage with the galaxy from a position of strength rather than fear. She moved to stand beside George, taking his hand in a gesture that sent shockwaves through the traditional council. The unveiling revealed truth between us, truth that strengthens rather than diminishes. I ask the council to affirm my position as heir, with the understanding that this Thiassi will be honored according to all our sacred traditions. Elder Vashi rose slowly from his seat. For a long moment, the ancient Vexaran studied Alatha and George, his expression unreadable. Then, to the surprise of many, he smiled. The ancient texts speak of a time when our people would reach beyond our world, when new bonds would be formed, that would strengthen rather than weaken us. He approached the platform where Alatha and George stood. I have studied the Thiassi between you. It is genuine, perhaps the most genuine I have witnessed in my long service. He turned to address the council. Tradition is not meant to imprison us in the past, but to guide us into the future. The princess and the human have completed the sacred rituals with honor and truth. I move that the succession challenge be dismissed and Princess Alatha's position as heir be reaffirmed. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. A clear majority of the council supported Alatha, with only the most conservative elements abstaining or opposing. Szeth was taken away to await judgment for his crimes, his political support evaporating in the face of his treachery. In the days that followed, Vexara began the slow process of stabilization. Szeth's supporters were investigated with several high-ranking nobles, found complicit in his plot. They faced punishment, ranging from exile to loss of position depending on their level of involvement. Szeth himself was sentenced to permanent exile on a remote outpost at the edge of Vexaran territory, a punishment considered more merciful than execution, but equally effective at removing his influence. For George and Alatha, the aftermath of the succession challenge brought new complexities. The third and final ritual of the Thiassi remained to be completed: the bonding of paths, a ceremony traditionally performed in the Great Hall of Vixara before the assembled nobility. The ritual solidifies the connection forged through the previous stages, Priestess Sirona explained during a private meeting in the royal chambers. It is not merely symbolic, but binds your life forces together in ways our ancients understood, but our science still struggles to fully explain. What exactly does that mean in practical terms? George asked, still adjusting to his new position. Ambassador Hayes had formally reassigned him as the permanent liaison to the royal court, a diplomatic acknowledgement of the reality created by the Thiassi. Those bound by the completed Thiassi share certain connections, Sirona replied. Emotions can be sensed across distances. In some cases, thoughts may be shared in moments of great need. Physical well-being is often linked. One's strength can sustain the other in times of weakness. It's not completely unlike some pair bonds in Earth cultures, Alatha added, though perhaps more tangible in its effects. George considered this information carefully. And once completed, can the bond be dissolved? Sirona's expression grew solemn. The Thiassi is for life, Captain Sullivan. It cannot be undone without grave consequences to both participants. This is why the final ritual is approached with such solemnity. After the priestess departed, George and Alatha stood on the balcony overlooking the capital city. The setting sun bathed Vixara in the same amber light that had greeted George on his first day on this alien world. So much had changed since then. You have concerns, Alatha observed. The connection between them had already grown stronger, allowing her to sense his emotional state, even without the final ritual. Not concerns exactly, George replied, but this is permanent, life-altering, for both of us. Alatha turned to face him, her emerald eyes searching his. Do you regret the path that brought us here? No, George answered without hesitation. But I wonder what it means for your future, for Vexara's future, an alien permanently bound to the future ruler. It creates precedent, Alatha acknowledged. Which is precisely what I have sought. A breaking of barriers, a new path forward. She placed her hand lightly on his. The question should perhaps be what it means for your future. The Thiassi binds you to Vexara as much as to me. George looked out over the alien city that had somehow become more familiar to him than any place on Earth. I've spent my life serving causes larger than myself, he said quietly. First Earth's military, then diplomatic security. But this feels different. More personal, yet also more significant. Because it is both, Alatha replied. The Thiassi connects us as individuals, but our connection will shape worlds. She hesitated, then added, If you truly wish to refuse the final ritual, it can be delayed, though not indefinitely without consequences. I would not have you bound unwillingly, even if tradition demands it. George turned to her, struck once again by her combination of strength and compassion. In the weeks since the assassination attempt, their relationship had evolved beyond the formal boundaries of the Thiassi. The time in the ancestral temple had created a foundation of trust and understanding that continued to deepen with each passing day. I don't wish to delay, he said finally. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. The bonding of path ceremony took place 3 weeks later, giving time for proper preparations and for representatives from Earth to arrive. The Great Hall of Vixara had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with both Vexaran symbols of eternity and subtle acknowledgments of Earth traditions. Ambassador Hayes led a delegation that included several high-ranking officials from Earth's diplomatic corps, and to George's surprise, his younger sister Julia, a xenobiologist who had been working on a research station in a neighboring system. "Couldn't miss my brother making interstellar history," Julia teased during their reunion. Then, more seriously, "Are you certain about this, George? The briefings we received suggest this bond is somehow biologically binding." "As certain as I can be," George replied honestly. "It's not a path I expected, but it feels right." Julia studied him with a scientist's scrutiny. "You've changed. There's something different about you, beyond the obvious circumstances." George smiled slightly. "Spending time in alien temples breathing sacred mists will do that to a person." "It's more than that." Julia placed a hand on his arm. "You seem at peace in a way I've never seen before." The observation stayed with George as he prepared for the ceremony. His sister was right. Despite the dangers and complications of recent weeks, he felt a clarity of purpose that had eluded him throughout his military career and diplomatic service. The ceremony itself was both simpler and more profound than George had anticipated. He and Alatha stood at the center of the Great Hall, surrounded by concentric circles of witnesses. The royal council in the innermost ring, followed by Vexaran nobles, Earth representatives, and various officials. Priestess Sirona presided, her elaborate ceremonial robes glittering with crystals that caught and refracted light throughout the hall. Elder Vashi stood opposite her, representing the traditional council's sanction of the proceedings. The Thiasi reaches completion with the bonding of paths. Sirona intoned her voice, carrying easily through the vast space. What began with sacrifice and blood, what deepened with truth and revelation, now culminates in the joining of two life forces across the stars. The ritual involved several symbolic elements: the twining of sacred cords around their wrists, the sharing of water from both Vexara and Earth, the exchange of vows in both languages. But the central act was both unexpected and breathtaking. At Sirona's direction, a small crystal basin was brought forward, filled with a luminescent liquid that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "The essence of the sacred mists collected and concentrated," Sirona explained. "When placed upon the heart, it creates the physical manifestation of the Thiasi bond." George and Alatha each received a small portion of the liquid on their palms. Following Sirona's instructions, they placed their hands over each other's hearts. The sensation was immediate and extraordinary. A warmth that spread from the point of contact throughout George's entire body, followed by a momentary flash of Alatha's consciousness, merging with his own. In that instant, he experienced her memories, her hopes, her dedication to her people. Not as concepts, but as lived experiences. Simultaneously, he felt her experiencing his own past, his sense of duty, his growing devotion to her and her world. When the moment passed, leaving them both breathing heavily from the intensity, George noticed a change. Where the liquid had touched his chest, a small pattern had formed on his skin. Not a Vexaran tiger stripe exactly, but a subtle whorl that echoed the patterns on Alatha's skin. Looking at her, he saw a similar mark on her chest, but in a pattern that somehow suggested Earth's continents. "The Thiasi is complete," Sirona announced as the hall erupted in sounds of wonder and appreciation. Two paths now joined as one. The celebration that followed was unlike anything George had experienced, a blend of solemn tradition and joyous festivity that seemed to characterize the best of Vexaran culture. The formal banquet included dishes from both worlds, music that alternated between Vexaran harmonies and Earth compositions, and speeches that ranged from politically significant to personally touching. Ambassador Hayes offered formal congratulations that cleverly balanced diplomatic recognition with genuine well wishes. Earth acknowledges this historic bond between our worlds, formalized not through treaties alone, but through living connection. Julia's toast was more personal. To my brother, who always found the most dramatic way possible to pursue cross-cultural understanding, she said, generating laughter from both species. May your bond bring joy to you both, and wisdom to our worlds. As the evening progressed, George and Alatha found a moment of relative privacy on a balcony overlooking the city. "How do you feel?" Alatha asked softly, her hand finding his. "Different," George admitted. "I can sense you somehow. Not just your presence, but your emotions, your essence." He touched the mark on his chest, still visible beneath his formal attire. "Is this what the Thiasi is truly about? This connection?" "It is the heart of it," Alatha replied. "Our ancestors believed that when lives become intertwined through acts of great significance, the universe itself acknowledges the connection." She smiled slightly. "Our scientists have other explanations involving quantum entanglement and neurological synchronization, but the experience remains the same." "And now," George asked, "what happens now that the rituals are complete?" Alatha's expression grew more serious. "Now we face the future. My eventual ascension to the throne, the continued opposition from traditionalists, the expansion of our alliance with Earth and other worlds." She squeezed his hand gently. "But we face it together with a bond that cannot be broken by political maneuvering or cultural differences." The weeks following the completion of the Thiasi brought significant changes to Vexaran society. With Zeth's conspiracy exposed and the legitimacy of Alatha's position reaffirmed, her progressive policies gained new support. The Royal Council approved expanded trade agreements with Earth and initiated diplomatic relations with 2 additional spacefaring species. For George, life settled into a new rhythm. His official title became Royal Consort and Earth Ambassador, a dual role that acknowledged both his personal connection to Alatha and his continuing representation of human interests. He took to the position with unexpected aptitude, finding that his military background and diplomatic training combined with his unique position gave him influence in both Vexaran and interstellar affairs. The Thiasi bond continued to develop between them, growing stronger and more nuanced with time. They discovered they could sense each other's emotional states across considerable distances, occasionally share brief thoughts in moments of stress or danger, and even draw on each other's strength when needed. 6 months after the completion of the rituals, Alatha's formal coronation as Crown Princess took place, the final step before she would eventually succeed her aging father as ruler of Vixara. George stood beside her during the ceremony, his presence no longer a source of controversy, but a symbol of the new era Alatha had promised. That evening, as they stood on what had become their favorite palace balcony, watching the twin moons rise over Vixara, Alatha turned to George with unusual hesitation. "There is one aspect of the Thiasi we have not yet discussed fully," she said. "The research conducted during your medical treatment after the assassination attempt revealed something extraordinary, a rare genetic compatibility between us." George nodded. "I remember. It's why the Vexaran medications worked so effectively." "It's more than that," Alatha continued. "According to our medical scientists, this compatibility means that offspring would be possible between us. The first viable human Vexaran children." The implication struck George with full force. "Children, I didn't think that would be biologically possible." "Nor did anyone until your genetic analysis. It would require some medical assistance, but it is indeed possible." She studied his expression carefully. "This is not an immediate consideration, of course. But as Crown Princess, the continuation of the royal line must eventually be addressed." George found himself imagining children with Alatha's emerald eyes and tiger-striped skin, perhaps with human features blended in. The thought was both startling and strangely appealing. "Hybrid royal heirs," he said softly. "That would certainly cement your reputation as a reformer." Alatha laughed, the sound like music in the evening air. "Indeed. Though that would be the least of the reasons to consider it, her expression grew more serious. I would not even mention this possibility if the Thiassi had not already bound us so completely. But now it seems like one more extraordinary development in an already extraordinary journey. George finished for her. He took her hands in his. Whatever the future holds, political challenges, interstellar diplomacy, or even hybrid royal children, we'll face it together. As they stood there in the amber light of the setting sun, George reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. A routine diplomatic assignment had become a life-altering journey across cultures, traditions, and even biology. What had begun with a single act of courage, jumping in front of a blade meant for an alien princess, had evolved into something no treaty or policy could have achieved: a living bridge between worlds. Behind them in the palace, representatives from 3 worlds discussed trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Before them, the city of Vixara spread out in all its alien beauty, familiar now in ways he could never have imagined. And beside him stood Alatha, connected to him through ancient traditions and new possibilities alike. The Thiassi had demanded more than either of them could have anticipated, but what it had given in return was beyond measure. A bond that transcended worlds, a purpose that spanned stars, and a future filled with unprecedented possibility. Together, Alatha agreed, her mind touching his through their bond. Always together,